This video addresses a sensitive subject, Germanwings Flight 9525. But I had to make it. You see, there is a discrepancy between the final accident report and the documentation collected during the investigation. This is the story of how an investigation was shaped and ultimately compromised by a single assumption. Hello aviators, how are you today? My name is Magnar. I'm a retired airline captain. Most aviation accidents result from a chain of events, and only a thorough and methodical investigation can establish the facts. Every possible factor must be assessed before a conclusion can be drawn. This takes time. It is also essential to respect the principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. This is especially important when the individual involved cannot defend themselves. On the 4th of November 2025, UPS Flight 2976 crashed shortly after takeoff. 2 days later, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, held a press briefing. The spokesperson presented the facts known at the time and then said the following.
Now, let me tell you a little bit about our process at the NTSB. What we will do is analyze the facts, determine the probable cause of this accident, and then issue a report on those recommendations.
In a discussion of the same accident, retired accident investigator Germanwings said, "It's very easy, even on a professional investigation team, to start out with assumptions, and then try to find data that support that assumption. This observation is highly relevant to Germanwings Flight 9525, an Airbus A320 that crashed in the French Alps on 24th of March 2015, killing all 150 people on board. Just 2 days after the crash, Marseille State Attorney Brice Robin held a press conference where he declared the co-pilot had deliberately flown the aircraft into the ground while alone in the cockpit. At that time, the investigation had barely begun. The accident was investigated by 5 agencies. In France, it was the investigating magistrates of the Marseille Juridical Court. Then it was the French Gendarmerie Aviation Unit, a military force with civil policing duties. They performed the accident investigation together with the 3rd agency, the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, who wrote the accident report. From the German side, the accident investigation was supported by the Federal Bureau of Accident Investigation, BFU. The criminal investigation was conducted by the Public Prosecutor's Office in Düsseldorf. This means there were 3 agencies who investigated the crash and 2 agencies who investigated the criminal case against the co-pilot. Together, they produced more than 20,000 pages of material, including witness interviews, medical records, forensic analysis, and transcripts from the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. In this video, I will show that those documents contradict the main conclusion of the final report from the BEA. I will present the investigation documents and compare them directly with the BEA report, allowing you to draw your own conclusions. The first and most important question I will address is this: did the co-pilot suffer from a mental disorder? The BEA's final report is 110 pages long, where 60 pages are devoted to mental health. Only a small portion addresses the aircraft systems, and strangely, no potential technical defects are discussed. The report is clearly written from the standpoint that the crash was caused by the co-pilot. On page 30, The report states that in August 2008, the co-pilot experienced a severe depressive episode and was hospitalized. On 10th of July 2009, his treating psychiatrist declared him fully recovered, and later that month, his aviation Class 1 medical certificate was issued. It had a waiver stating that it would become invalid if there were a relapse into depression. While most of this information is correct, the claim that he was hospitalized is not. In his Class 1 medical application dated 24 February 2010, yes is ticked for admission to hospital, but the remarks read 126 TE, meaning tonsil ectopy, removal of his tonsils, which occurred when he was 4 years old. Between 2010 and 2014, the co-pilot had his Class 1 medical certificate renewed or revalidated regularly. On page 32 in the report, we can read, all the AMEs, aviation medical examiners, from the Lufthansa Aeromedical Center, who examined the co-pilot for the revalidations of the Class 1 medical certificate, were aware of the waiver that the co-pilot had. They all assessed his psychological and psychiatric fitness through observation of behavior and discussions. None of the responses provided by the co-pilot raised any concern among the examiners about a mood, neurotic, personality, mental, or behavior disorder that would have required further psychiatric evaluation. In December 2014, the co-pilot began experiencing visual disturbances and sleep problems. He consulted several specialists, none of whom identified an organic cause. In other words, the symptoms could not be explained by any physical findings. The following summary is based on the family doctor's medical records concerning the co-pilot. The first recorded visit took place on 4th of December 2014. The physician noted suspected air infection and viral flu-like infection, and prescribed medication for those symptoms. On 22nd December, the same assessment was recorded and additional medication was provided. On 22nd January 2015, the family doctor wrote, "The eyes show no abnormal findings. Dark circles under the eyes." On 17th of February 2015, the family doctor diagnosed the co-pilot with psychosomatic symptom complex and referred him to psychotherapy. He was prescribed Zopiclone, an antidepressant. On 22nd February, the co-pilot was issued sick leave until 24th of February. On the 24th of February, the family doctor noted, tried Zopiclone, appointment with eye doctor and psychotherapist, Dr. NN. On the same day, the treating psychiatrist prescribed Mizapine, an antidepressant, together with medication to assist with sleep. This is documented in the psychiatrist's medical records. On the 9th of March, the family doctor recorded, eye doctor Dr. NN suspected psychosis. The 10th of March, the family doctor wrote, possible emerging psychosis associated with worsening visual disturbances in absence of any identifiable organic cause, and referred the co-pilot for day treatment at a psychiatric clinic. On page 33 of the final report, it states, the limited medical and personal data available to the safety investigation did not make it possible for an ambiguous psychiatric diagnosis to be made. It further states, however, the majority of the team of experts consulted by the BEA agreed that the limited medical information available may be consistent with the co-pilot having suffered from a psychotic depressive episode that started in December 2014, which lasted until the day of the accident. In my view, expressions such as did not make it possible and may be consistent with do not amount to proof beyond reasonable doubt. Furthermore, the term psychotic depressive episode refers to a severe depressive episode with psychotic features, such as delusions and hallucinations. Such a condition is generally serious and difficult to conceal particularly over an extended period. Moreover, the BA's final report does not mention that 2 psychiatric assessments were conducted in the weeks preceding the accident. On 29 January 2015, the treating psychiatrist issued a specialist medical certificate stating, "In my opinion, from a psychiatric point of view, the patient is completely healthy. There is no indication whatsoever of any illness within the psychiatric spectrum. Mr. NN does not, with regard to psychiatric illness, carry a higher risk than the average of the population." This document is absent from the final report. On 16 March 2015, 8 days before the accident, the co-pilot was again examined by the treating psychiatrist. The patient record states, "Diagnose ICD F45.0V, somatization disorder, where the letter V stands for Verdacht, suspicion, and ICD F51.0G, non-organic insomnia, where letter G stands for Gesichert, verified." The clinical findings read, "Alert, all-run-oriented patient, formally restricted, that's vision, but distractible, restlessness, tension, nervousness, brooding, no delusions, no sensory illusions, no compulsion, mild anxiety, undisturbed drive, no withdrawal, sleep with ESS, disturbance of falling asleep, and DSS, disturbance of remaining asleep, no suicidal tendencies." This information is also absent from the final report. It appears that the BEA report treats the family doctor's suspicion as a confirmed diagnosis, while omitting the psychiatrist's assessment, although the latter was the only qualified to establish a definitive psychiatric diagnosis. The investigation files also include an interview with a captain who flew the co-pilot the day before the accident and reported a positive impression of him. In addition, the co-pilot and his girlfriend had plans to start a family and discussed their upcoming wedding only a few days before the accident. On page 85 in the final report, it is stated, "On the day of the accident, the pilot was still suffering from a psychiatric disorder, which was possibly a psychotic depressive episode, and was taking psychotropic medication." On page 33, it is stated, "Toxicological examinations of the co-pilot's human tissue found at the accident site were conducted by the French juridical authorities. The presence of citalopram and mirtazapine, which are 2 antidepressant medications, as well as Zopiclone, which is a sleeping aid medication, was detected." This is the report from the laboratory. It states that the analysis of the tissue samples detected citalopram and mirtazapine in very small amounts. The concentrations were significantly lower than what would be expected during regular daily use of those medications. Zopiclone was not detected in the tissue. The laboratory also analyzed hair samples from the co-pilot. The laboratory detected citalopram, mirtazapine, and Zopiclone in the older hair strands, indicating those medicines had been used previously. The laboratory summarized its findings with the following conclusion. At the time of death, Mr. NN very likely had antidepressants present in non-toxic concentrations. It is impossible to determine whether the circulation blood concentrations were within the therapeutic range. Therefore, it is impossible to determine whether the antidepressants were effective shortly before death or not. Thus, there was no evidence that the co-pilot was under influence of those medications while he was on active duty. Despite the statements from the psychiatrist and from the laboratory, Düsseldorf public prosecutor Christoph Kumpa remained convinced that the co-pilot had deliberately crashed the aircraft. In 2024, the producer of a documentary about the accident asked Kumpa some questions. Kumpa replied in an email dated 19 December 2024. The co-pilot's medical records were assessed by the undersigned. There was no need to consult experts in this respect. The undersigned had sufficient expertise on his own as a long-standing department head for capital criminal cases, death investigation proceedings, and medical malpractice proceedings. There was no reason to verify the data. For me, the documents from the psychiatrist and the laboratory report confirmed the co-pilot was not suffering from a psychotic depressive episode. Nor was he under influence of medication when the aircraft crashed, as the accident report claims. And this fact turns everything upside down, because if the co-pilot was not suicidal, then what caused the aircraft to crash? The cockpit voice recorder installed in the accident aircraft had a total recording capacity of 4 hours, with the final 30 minutes recorded in high quality. The last 30 minutes are recorded on 4 separate channels. Channel 1 captured the captain's headset audio, distinguishing between microphone input and received audio. Channel 2 records the co-pilot's headset. Channel 3 records the observer's headset and the public address system. And Channel 4 records the cockpit area microphone. The available documentation confirms that the accident aircraft's cockpit voice recorder was configured in accordance with the standard arrangement. On 26th of March, when the Marseille State Attorney Brice Robin stated that the co-pilot had deliberately flown the aircraft into the ground, he had only just received an initial transcript from the cockpit voice recorder. The recording had not yet been fully analyzed, nor had it been synchronized with the flight data recorder. On what basis, then, could he have been certain that it was the co-pilot who was alone in the cockpit? This document, dated 28th of March, originates from the French Gendarmerie Aviation Unit and has been translated from French to German. It states, based on the factual findings gathered during this work, we can assume that the strong voice captured on the various tracks is that of the flight captain. Another document, also dated 28th of March, states, Track 1 contains the last 30 minutes in high quality from the co-pilot's headset. Track 2 contains the last 30 minutes in high quality from the captain's headset. This raises an important question. How could the captain's headset be connected to track 2, channel 2, and the co-pilot's to track 1, channel 1? The headset connections are located above the respective side windows and cannot be interchanged. This issue is critical because, according to the cockpit voice recorder transcript, it was the pilot speaking on channel 2 who left the cockpit. The BEA did not publish the transcript covering the first 3.5 hours of the cockpit voice recorder. However, for the final 30 minutes, there are 4 different transcripts. One of them is labeled original. It is written in French, though the initial conversations appear in German with French translations. After approximately 6.5 minutes, most of the dialogue is written in French. Portions of the conversations are redacted, and at times it is difficult to fully understand what the crew members are discussing. A second transcript covers the same time frame, but is entirely translated into German. In this version, all spoken dialogue is redacted. However, it includes additional cockpit sounds, which provide a clearer sense of the events that occurred. For this document, I have combined both transcripts and translated the conversations into English. Because the material was translated from German to French and then into English, some nuances and meanings may have been lost in the process. At the end of the video, you will see each page of the transcripts, allowing you to pause and review them in detail. The transcript begins at 09:10, 12 seconds. 3 asterisks indicate that the conversation has been redacted. The label 12_ATC shows that air traffic control, ATC, is transmitting over the radio. These transmissions are audible in both pilots' headsets. According to the aircraft's technical documentation, Channel 1 corresponded to the captain's headset and Channel 2 to the co-pilots. Early in the recording, the pilots discussed the schedule for the following day. The pilot speaking on Channel 2 mentions he is scheduled to fly to Paris, Charles de Gaulle, and Milan Malpensa the next day. This matches the captain's roster for the 25th. This detail is the only indication suggesting that the captain must have been on Channel 2 and the co-pilot on Channel 1. This apparent switch of channels is highly unusual. It is unclear whether it resulted from an error in the aircraft's audio control system or whether the channels were switched after the data was downloaded from the cockpit voice recorder. Only the BEA will be able to clarify this. Neither the pilot's family members nor their colleagues identified the voices. Additionally, experts in human factors were not consulted during the cockpit voice recorder analysis. The label 12_XH1 indicates that the co-pilot is speaking into the microphone on his headset, Channel 1, and the audio is heard in both headsets. The label 124_XH2 indicates that the captain is speaking into the microphone on his headset, Channel 2. In addition to be heard in both headsets, this audio is also recorded by the cockpit area microphone on Channel 4. At 09:12:15 seconds, the cockpit door buzzer sounded. This buzzer is activated when someone in the cabin enters a code on the cockpit door panel. According to the Flight Crew Operating Manual, FCOM, the buzzer can be set to sound for 1 to 9 seconds. In this aircraft, it was set for 1 second. The cockpit door is reinforced to resist any forced entry, and a video camera allows the pilots to see who is outside before they unlock the door. The door is unlocked by moving the cockpit door switch to the unlock position. When set to lock, the door is secured, and the buzzer and keypad are disabled for 5 minutes. At 09:12:20 seconds, the cockpit door opened and a cabin attendant entered. At 09:15:53 seconds, the cockpit door opened again and the cabin attendant left the cockpit. At 09:15:58 seconds, Barcelona Air Traffic Control instructed the crew to contact Marseille. The call sign was Germanwings 18 Golf. Since the captain was handling radio communications, we know he was acting as pilot monitoring. Therefore, the co-pilot was pilot flying. The captain contacted Marseille, reporting that they were passing flight level 290, 29,000 feet pressure altitude, and climbing to flight level 300. The transcript contains numerous briefing sounds and unidentified mechanical sounds. The cockpit environment is noisy due to cooling fans, air vents, and general airflow. As a result, not every sound can be precisely identified. Even a ball pen can produce an unknown sound. At 09:19:04 seconds, the flight was cleared to climb to flight level 380. At 09:30:08 seconds, the captain says, "Jetzt gehe ich mal weg, ja? I'll just go for a moment, okay? Dein Funk, your radio." The co-pilot replies, "Mein Funk, my radio." The captain then removed his headset, released the seatbelt, and activated the seat's electrical motion. The co-pilot operated the cockpit door toggle switch to open the door. Most of these actions were recorded as impulsive sound or unknown sound, although the sound of the seat movement is marked with a question mark. At 09:30:27 seconds, the cockpit door is closed. Now, something unusual happened. From 09:31:16 seconds, the co-pilot made 4 exhalations in 9.2 seconds. That is a rate of 26 per minute. From 09:32:40 seconds, the co-pilot made 32 exhalations in 1 minute 3 seconds. That is 30 per minute. This is not normal. A person at rest typically has a breathing rate between 12 and 20 times per minute. A significantly elevated breathing rate can eventually lead to loss of consciousness, but there must always be an underlying cause. I will outline 3 possible scenarios, beginning with smoke and fume events. On aircraft such as the Airbus A320, the air conditioning system is supplied with pressurized bleed air from the engine's compressor stages. This air is cooled and then distributed to both the cabin and the cockpit. If engine oil leaks into the bleeder system, for example due to a worn or damaged engine seal, the oil can vaporize at high temperatures and enter the cabin as smoke or fumes. All the engines may have degraded seals, and in this case, both engines on the accident aircraft were reportedly due for maintenance. Jet engine oils contains organophosphates, including compounds such as triresyl phosphate, TCP, which are toxic and have been associated with neurological symptoms. In addition, fumes may contain elevated levels of carbon monoxide, CO. Carbon monoxide binds the hemoglobin and reduces the blood's ability to absorb oxygen from the lungs. This lack of oxygen can trigger rapid breathing and, in severe cases, loss of consciousness. Here is a list of some incidents with smoke and fumes in the cabin and cockpit that resulted in elevated CO levels in the blood of the crew members. It is noteworthy that the laboratory analysis of the co-pilot's remains reportedly did not test for carbon monoxide levels or other potential fume-related substances. It should also be noted that on the day of the accident, the operator entered 65 work orders into the aircraft's electronic technical log, including the replacement of both engines. Another possible explanation is a sudden cardiovascular event, such as a heart disease or stroke, which can restrict blood flow to the heart or brain and often leads to increased breathing. It is commonly understood that elevated cholesterol levels may contribute to arterial blockage over time. However, many acute cardiovascular events are triggered by blood clot formation, thrombosis, rather than gradual narrowing alone. Blood clots can abruptly block blood flow, even in individuals who appear healthy. Such events are not limited to older individuals. In 2011, Norwegian elite football player Carl Erik Torp suffered a cardiac arrest during a match. He survived, but was unable to continue his playing career and later become a television football commentator. A third possibility is a sudden seizure. Seizures can occur unexpectedly, even in individuals with no prior history of epilepsy. I have personal experience with this. Several years ago, my brother suffered a seizure caused by a brain tumor pressing on a blood vessel. He had no prior history of epilepsy. After surgical removal of the tumor, he fully recovered. A comparable aviation incident occurred on 17 February 2024 aboard Lufthansa Flight 1140, when the co-pilot became incapacitated while alone on the flight deck. According to the investigation report, just 36 seconds after the captain left the cockpit to use the lavatory, the co-pilot experienced a seizure. During the episode, the co-pilot inadvertently operated switches and made flight control inputs. However, the autopilot remained engaged and the flight director modes were unchanged. The first officer was unconscious for approximately 10 minutes. When the captain returned, he attempted to re-enter the cockpit using the keypad to send a request signal, which activates a buzzer inside the cockpit. Normally, the pilot inside would check the video monitor and move the door switch to unlock. There was no response. After 3 further attempts and an intercom call from a cabin crew member, The captain entered the emergency access code, triggering a 15-second buzzer. Before the timer expired, the co-pilot regained consciousness and opened the cockpit door. These three scenarios, smoke or fume exposure, cardiovascular disease, or a sudden seizure, are possible explanations for why a pilot might lose consciousness and become unable to respond. Other causes are also plausible. The key point is that acute medical emergencies can occur suddenly and without warning. Therefore, a pilot should never be alone on the flight deck. On page 13 of the final report, the following is stated. At 09:30:53, the selected altitude on the FCU changed in 1 second from 38,000 feet to 100 feet. 1 second later, the autopilot changed to open descent mode and autothrust changed to throttle idle mode. The airplane started to descend and both engines' speed decreased. The Flight Control Unit, FCU, is located on a glare shield and serves as the primary interface between the pilots and the Flight Management and Guidance Computers, FMGCs, which controls the aircraft's automated flight functions. Through the FCU, pilots can select target altitude, speed, and heading, as well as engage specific autopilot and autothrust modes. The aircraft is equipped with 2 Flight Management and Guidance Computers, FMGC1 and FMGC2. Each computer independently generates commands for the autopilot, flight director, and autothrust systems, with FMGC1 controlling autopilot 1 and FMGC2 controlling autopilot 2. The FCU and the FMGCs exchange data in both directions, meaning that an FMGC can modify indications displayed on the FCU. The selectable altitude range on the FCU extends from a minimum of 100 feet up to maximum 49,000 feet. The flight data recorder logs the selected altitude once per second. Is it possible to rotate the altitude selector from 38,000 feet down to 100 feet in less than 1 second? To evaluate this, I conducted tests using our in-house Airbus A320 full flight simulator. In the first attempt, the change from 38,000 feet to 100 feet took 0.7 seconds. In the second attempt, it took 0.8 seconds. However, because the flight data recorder records data only once per second, and because the exact timing of the selected movement cannot be precisely aligned with the recording interval, the recorded value could capture an intermediate altitude during the rotation. In such a case, the full transition will appear on the flight data recorder over a 2-second time frame. This makes it less likely that the flight data recorder will record 38,000 feet in 1 second and 100 feet in the next, without any intermediate value. In a documentary aired on Sky Channel, investigators were able to replicate, in a simulator, a scenario in which the selected altitude changed from 38,000 feet to 100 feet with the blink of an eye. Can such an event occur in real life? Yes, it can. On the 19th of March 2017, a Germanwings Airbus A319 experienced several uncommanded autopilot mode changes and 2 uncommanded descents, all corrected by the crew. Following that incident, Airbus recommended replacing FMGC1, confirming that such mode changes can be initiated by the FMGC. There have been other Airbus incidents in which automation malfunctions caused in-flight upsets and injuries to passengers and cabin crew. The most serious occurred on 7th October 2008, when a Qantas Airbus A330 experienced sudden uncommanded pitch-down events after an Air Data Inertial Reference Unit transmitted intermittent erroneous data, prompting the flight control computers to command nose-down inputs. As a result, 119 people were injured. The most recent incident occurred on 30 October 2025, when a JetBlue Airbus A320 suddenly pitched down, injuring several people. Preliminary investigations traced the event to the elevator and aileron computer. Investigators determined that intense solar or cosmic radiation at cruising altitude can cause data corruption, known as single event upsets or particle-induced bit flips in certain software versions, potentially leading to erroneous control commands. As a result, approximately 6,000 aircraft were grounded until affected software was updated. But this is not all. During the investigation of Germanwings Flight 9525, the French Gendarmerie Aviation Unit noted that the flight data recorder had recorded that open descent and descent mode activated simultaneously. According to Airbus, this should not be possible. Open descent modes means the aircraft is descending towards the selected altitude without following a specific vertical path. The vertical profile depends on the selected airspeed, which can be managed by the pilot via the FCU or is managed by the Flight Management System, FMS. Descent mode means the descent profile is managed by the FMGC and the speed is managed by the FMS. The fact that both descent modes were activated simultaneously may indicate a serious failure in at least one computer. And this may also explain why the selected speed changed multiple times as the aircraft descended. For example, at 9 hours, 33 minutes, 35, it is reported that selected speed changed 6 times over a period of 13 seconds. And this doesn't make sense at all. On page 28, the final report includes a graph illustrating variations in the selected altitude during the earlier flight that day from Düsseldorf to Barcelona. At that time, the first officer was alone in the cockpit. On page 86, the report further states that actions of the autopilot system during the first flight of the day may be interpreted as a rehearsal for suicide. What I would particularly like to know is what the co-pilot said to the captain after he returned to the cockpit. The answer to that question lies in the cockpit voice recorder. Another key question is whether the aircraft experienced similar events during that flight or on earlier sectors. The answer to this can be found in the flight data recorder. Although the graph reproduced in the report is of relatively low resolution, the investigation files contain a version in high resolution. It makes it possible to conduct a detailed second-by-second analysis of the selected altitude changes. At 07:20:29 seconds, the aircraft was instructed to descend from flight level 370 to flight level 350, a routine change requiring only 2 clicks on the altitude selector. The selected altitude then dropped from 35,000 feet to 100 feet within 1 second. While demanding, this is still possible with deliberately rapid human input. Shortly afterward, the altitude increased in 2 steps to 49,000 feet, then dropped to a low value before being set to 35,000 feet. This entire sequence took about 3 seconds and is consistent with human action. I replicated a similar sequence in 3.3 seconds. At 07:21:10 seconds, the flight was cleared to descend to flight level 210. The time taken to set this altitude clearly reflects human input. The altitude then dropped from 21,000 feet to 100 feet within 1 second. Then, the altitude jumped from 100 feet back to 21,000 feet within 1 second. While technically possible, this is extremely difficult. My attempts range from 2.5 seconds to a minimum of 1.0 seconds. Shortly after, the altitude again dropped from 21,000 feet to 100 feet and was reset to 25,000 feet, overshooting in the process, clearly indicating human input. Whether selecting 25,000 feet was an error made by the co-pilot, or he received an amended clearance, remains unknown. Next, the altitude fell from 25,000 feet to 100 feet. Then it jumped back to 25,000 feet within 1 second, which is almost impossible by a human. To sum it up, the graph shows 4 deliberately human actions, but the rapid jumps from 100 feet to 21,000 feet and from 100 feet to 25,000 feet within a single second are nearly impossible for a human. Given the 2017 incident that prompted Airbus to recommend replacement of a flight management and guidance computer, along with several other automation-related occurrences, it is evident that computer malfunctions do happen. This can also explain the other unusual indications described in the report. Back to the transcript from the cockpit voice recorder. At 09:33:47 seconds, Marseille ATC noticed the aircraft was descending and attempted to contact the flight. At 09:34:30 seconds, the cockpit buzzes sounded for 1.1 seconds, accompanied by an unknown impulsive noise. This is discussed on page 35 of the final report. It states that the buzzes sounded for 980 milliseconds, which was consistent with previous recordings of the buzzer. An accompanying clacking noise could not be identified. The report notes, the clacking noise did not end the buzzer, as an action on the cockpit door toggle switch would. In addition, the noise was significantly louder than a switch activation. On page 36, the report further states, therefore, the possibility that it corresponds to an emergency access request cancelled after 980 milliseconds by an action on the toggle switch is considered to be extremely remote. In other words, this was a routine request to open a cockpit door. At 09:35:03 seconds, the intercom buzzer sounded. To respond, the pilot would simply need to speak into the microphone on his headset. At 09:35:32 seconds, knocks were heard on the cockpit door. At 09:36:04 seconds, the intercom buzzer sounded again, followed by more knocks on the door. At 09:37:11 seconds, 5 more knocks occurred, accompanied by the voice of a man. At 09:37:47 seconds, 7 strong knocks were heard, and the knocking continued with increasing intensity. At 09:40:41 seconds, the ground proximity warning system detected that the aircraft was close to the ground and began issuing terrain and pull-up alerts. The recording ended at 09:41:04 seconds. The cockpit voice recorder transcript indicates that the cockpit door buzzes sounded only once, and for just 1 second, 980 milliseconds to be exact. Did the co-pilot move the selector to the lock position? There is no evidence confirming that. Moreover, if the selector had been set to lock, the cabin door control panel would have been disabled for 5 minutes. After that period, another access request could have been attempted. According to the transcript, the pilot remaining in the cockpit was briefing at a rate of up to 30 breaths per minute. Such a respiratory rate may be consistent with an incapacitation. In a document issued by the French Gendarmerie Aviation Unit, it is stated, listening to the various recording channels revealed that briefing could be heard via the mouth microphones, which means that he was alive, although it was not possible to prove whether he was also conscious. If the co-pilot had been unconscious, why did the captain not use the emergency access code to open the cockpit door? In addressing this question, I must rely on oral testimony, as no written documentation is available. A few days prior to the accident, the same aircraft reportedly experienced an unusual event. During a ground stop, both pilots exited the cockpit and the door closed behind them. They were unable to reopen it, even after entering the emergency access code, and a technician had to assist them to unlock the door manually. According to these accounts, the number 2 key on the keypad was inoperative. It remains unclear whether this malfunction was formally recorded in the aircraft's technical log. If the crew of Flight 9525 had been aware that the keypad was partially unserviceable, they would have been required to follow the minimum equipment list, which requires that at least 2 authorized persons must remain in the cockpit at all times. It is also noteworthy that, at the time of the accident, Germanwings did not have a procedure requiring daily functional testing of the emergency access code. To summarize, I have never encountered a case in which the available evidence appears to diverge so significantly from the conclusions of an official accident report. ICAO Annex 13 requires investigative authorities, such as the BEA, to conduct their work independently, first establishing the factual record, then analyzing the evidence, and only afterwards drawing conclusions. In this instance, however, it appears that the conclusion was formed at an early stage, with the subsequent investigation following that premise, rather than following the evidence to guide the outcome. The investigation documentation establishes the following facts. 1. The co-pilot had no diagnosed mental disorder. 2. He was not under the influence of medication, drugs, alcohol, or similar substances. 3. He was alone in the cockpit. 4. The cockpit door emergency access code was never activated. 5. There was no procedure in place requiring daily testing of the emergency access code. Furthermore, it is plausible that the co-pilot may have been incapacitated. It is also technically plausible that the aircraft entered a descent without deliberately pilot input, a scenario that has occurred in other documented incidents. Questions have also been raised regarding the co-pilot's iPad, which reportedly contained searches for terms such as suicide and Airbus cockpit door. However, this was not the iPad initially recovered from his apartment. The search history on his personal device reportedly showed no suspicious activity. Moreover, as a trained pilot with full access to the aircraft's manuals, there would have been little reason to search externally for cockpit door information. His girlfriend's iPad also reportedly contained a normal browsing history. The device associated with the suspicious searches was handed over to the police at a later stage, and multiple individuals are said to have had access to it. Additional unresolved questions remain. Why were the victims' mobile phones reportedly returned to their families with the memory erased? And why were 65 work orders entered into the aircraft's electronic technical log at the day of the accident? At this point, however, this video is already long enough, so I will conclude here. What are your thoughts? Should the BEA reopen the investigation and conduct a new, fully independent review? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, a sincere thank you to the members who support this channel. Thank you for watching.
Mm-hmm.